The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show with me, Charles Christian. Thank you for tuning in again. Now, on this week's show, we've got another interview and we're going to be cracking on with it straight away. So let's get going. Now, you'll recall last week we talked to John Linwood Grant about occult detective fiction. But this week we head in exactly the opposite direction with a tale of ghostly encounters in true detective investigations. In the hot seat is Paul Rimmasch, who has worked in law enforcement for 23 years as a crime scene investigator, with most of that time being with the Weber Metro CSI in the state of Utah. Paul is also an adjunct professor at Weber State University and is active in the training of law enforcement officers and crime scene investigators. It was his own personal experiences, plus war stories passed on to him by other police personnel serving in forces across the US, that prompted him to write his latest book, Fingerprints and Phantoms, which has the intriguing subtitle, True Tales of Law Enforcement Encounters with the Paranormal and the Strange. Hello, Paul. Good to be speaking to you again today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Right, now I've been reading the book, and first it's called Fingerprints and Phantoms, and we'll be putting full contact detail and links and things on the website. But first of all, congratulations, because it's very well written. It's, you know, you find yourself, I'll just have a quick dip in here, and then, 20 minutes later you're still reading it and engrossed in it. So congratulations on that. Was that your first book? This your first book?
No, it was my first book of that sort, but I had two previous novels that I have written. So yeah, this is my third book.
It shows. Right, now, the point about your book is you are talking about, we'll give the subtitle, Tales of Law Enforcement Encounters with Ghosts and the Paranormal. Now, this is always intriguing because you always get the impression that the police, law enforcement are particularly hostile to anything of a paranormal flavour. When you get people who say they're psychic saying, I can solve your cases for you. But you are actually a forensic scientist, so it's sort of even more heresy. So tell us how the book came about, how you sort of moved from impartial crime scene investigator, where it's objective evidence you're looking for, to taking an interest in what many people would think is really slightly woo-woo stuff.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I do get that a lot. And in a way, I was even worried when I wrote it that it would kind of bring undue criticism or scrutiny on me. But the way I look at it, for starters, I grew up a religious person, and so matters, and still am a religious person, and so spirits and the afterlife and different thing. I mean, that's part of my belief system.
Yes,
and so you can't necessarily separate that out of your other aspects of your life. It's always kind of there. But being a forensic scientist to me means that in the truest sense, the way we should pursue truth, it means that, for me, it means that you need to have your mind open for all sorts of possibilities. And the way I explain it is that there's two approaches to gain knowledge that are out there. One of them is a top-down approach, and this is what a lot of people call the scientific method. and that's one of its names. But it's a way of gathering knowledge, or a way of coming to truth, where you first formulate a theory, and then you go and you test, and you gather information, you conduct experiments, and you test your theory. And then eventually, after you've tested your theory, hopefully you have the intellectual honesty to jettison that theory if it doesn't fit the facts, or you prove your theory through experimentation, and then you come to some sense of truth. And that's great. I in no way, shape, or form want to be critical of that point of view. But in forensic science, it's better for you to take a bottom-up approach. Because you don't want to walk into a crime scene, or you don't want to have a piece of evidence and have a theory already in your mind. You want to go where the evidence takes you, right?
Yeah.
And one of the problems with the top-down approach to truth acquisition, or gaining information, is that sometimes anchoring can take place, or it's called the anchoring fallacy in some circles. And what happens in anchoring is that you have your theory and you like your theory. And so when you start to have information come in, or experimentation or data come in that goes against your theory, you can tend to say, well, if you look at it this way, it'll still fit my theory. Or if we just ignore this little part of the data, then I can still have my theory. And so people will get locked into an idea. Now, that is very dangerous when we're in a crime scene or a forensic situation. You don't want to be locked into a theory, because we're dealing with people's lives and liberties here, right? Like you want to go where the facts go. And so the way I was trained to think, and in school and by my mentor, his name's Russ Dean, he still teaches forensic up at Weber State University, and how he taught us to teach when we were young crime scene investigators, is to walk into a scenario and have no theory. You walk in.
Yeah.
And then you say, oh, look at this little piece. Maybe this means this. And then you go a little further. Oh, and you add some more information. And you were just slowly building. You're not having a theory yet until you get all the facts in place. And then you're like, well, the most logical explanation for everything that we're seeing is this. And it's this bottom-up approach. That's the way I approach my crime scenes and my forensic work. And I think it's very important to do so, because all over the news and it doesn't take long to look where investigators charged the wrong person, and the wrong person went to prison for many years because they wouldn't let go of their theory.
Yeah. So certainly, I was going to say, certainly in the UK, when you read appeal court cases, that's one of the things that the police become fixated with. Right. A theory or a suspect, and view everything as either supporting their case or being irrelevant. And sadly, many instances, the true criminal goes undetected, and the lapse of time means they're never brought to justice.
Yeah, it happens here as well. And it's unfortunate, because that top-down approach, you can get anchored to your theory. Now, how this all applies to the world of the paranormal is that many people will go into a scenario and say, well, I don't believe in ghosts, so nothing is going to tell me otherwise. Or I don't believe in the anomalous, there's always a scientific explanation. And so they have this idea, this theory right from the beginning, and nothing is really going to push them off. But where I have tried, and I'm not perfect, I don't want to sound really sanctimonious here, like I never make any mistakes or have any lapses in judgments, but I try to have that bottom-up approach. Now, when it comes to certain instances that people would consider to be paranormal, if you don't have an idea in the beginning, if you're not anchored to your theory and just follow the evidence, sometimes the only explanation is there is no scientific explanation. There is something weird going on.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you one of the stories in the book. This was one of the first experiences that happened to me, but this is a good example of that. Now, let me just say that you could probably call me a skeptic.
Mm-hmm.
When people come to me with a ghost story or something weird, I don't instantly just like, oh, I believe everything. I'm like, oh, it could have been. Like, I'm actually fairly skeptical about a lot of the stories that I hear. But there are some that you can't rule out. You just can't rule it out. Now, the story in the book, and this is a good example of what I'm talking about, is it was pretty new in my career, and there was a really vicious homicide that I was called to. An estranged husband and wife. They were in a process of getting a divorce, and it seemed like it was pretty amicable. But then one night he just kind of flips out and kills her and stabs her many times. Very bloody, very gruesome scene. And when we responded to the scene and you walked into the apartment, you could feel a presence there. Like, even when you were alone, when no one else was there, just you and the deceased individual, or even after she was removed, you could feel something.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so tangible that all of us on the crime scene team, we began to, when we'd walk into the scene, we would say hello and then the victim's name, because you could just feel it. Okay, now maybe you can explain that away. Whatever. We were young crime scene investigators. It was a brutal scene, very emotional. So okay, you can explain that away. But several years later, the apartment was cleaned and restored, and someone else was living in it. And it was a couple, and they had no knowledge that there had been a homicide in their apartment.
Mm-hmm.
And so one day they needed to call the police for a minor matter. It was a noise complaint or a juvenile disturbance, something like that. It was just a minor thing. They had to make a little police report, and that was going to be the end of it. And so the officer responds. And it just so happened that the officer who responded to that apartment where the homicide occurred had been one of the first responders when it happened.
Yeah.
So it was a little weird for him to be back into the scene. But when he's there, he's just taking the report. He doesn't say anything, just really routine business. And at the end, when he's about ready to leave, the lady of the house says, officer, can I ask you something real quick? And he's like, sure, go ahead. And she goes, was there a homicide in these apartments? And he said when she asked him that, he could feel like the hair kind of stand up on the back of his neck, because it triggered, kind of a memories for him. And he's like, yes. And she goes, oh, well, which unit was it? Which apartment?
Yeah.
And the officer's like, well, are you sure you want to know? And she goes, yeah. And he said, well, this one. And so all during this conversation, her husband or boyfriend or whatever, sitting on the couch. And when he says this apartment, the boyfriend goes, well, that explains a few things. And then just was going to leave it at that. But the officer's like, well, what do you mean? And they said, oh, just, some weird things happen here. Like the light in the hall will turn on by itself. And then the bathroom door will be closed. And then all of a sudden it will just open up. And at that point, the officer felt the blood drain from his head. Now, why was that such a significant detail? Well, when this girl was murdered, she was probably trying to get into the bathroom to get away from her husband, get away from the estate.
Yeah.
But the bathroom door opened outward, and so she was pancaked against it, and then that's right there, pancaked against the bathroom door, was where she was killed. Now, why that's so significant is this detail was never given in the media. This wasn't on the news. It wasn't in the paper. The exact spot, the exact kind of mechanism, it was never discussed. And so these people, years removed, having no knowledge of what even happened, described kind of a crucial area and even action of this homicide.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I hear that story, I'm like, well, how could they possibly know? Like, my skeptical side, where I'm going from the bottom up and just gathering this information, how would they have possibly known where this happened? But they had this crucial detail that in death, this poor girl was trying to open that door, which she couldn't do in life. So that's a story that I can't dismiss, where I try to gather information from the bottom up. That's a story I can't dismiss out of hand. So is there some other explanation? Maybe, I guess. But, the different aspects of it, it sure seems like a legitimate encounter to me.
Give us another, for instance, from your book.
Well, one of the most interesting things this was kind of the story that launched the book, basically, or got me really interested in writing the stories. And it was, what happened is, I was every Halloween, around Halloween season, I love Halloween, have ever since I was a kid. And so when I would go out on calls with officers, I would just start to ask them, hey, have you ever had anything weird happen? Ever had any ghost stories? And so just over the years, people had told me stuff. And my wife said, hey, those are really good stories. You should write those down one day. And I'm like, oh, I will. Yeah, that's a good idea. But I hadn't really got around to it. But the story that really launched me really gathering the stories and writing the book happened to one of my dear, dear friends, a colleague of mine. We used to work together. Now he moved on to a different agency. But my dear friend, Mitch. And what's really interesting is that a ghost followed Mitch home from a crime scene. And
right.
That has really huge implications for everybody in the first responder business. And since this book, I've heard other stories, but it really is interesting because I always say we're always worried about the physical things that we bring home, right?
Yes.
So we walk through a bloody crime scene, we're going to put on coveralls, and when we get home, we take our boots off before we walk into the house. We wash our clothes, we hand sanitize even before the pandemic. We're really conscious about those things physically that we're going to bring home or biologically. But it had never occurred to me that someone would latch onto you, some spirit would latch onto you at a crime scene and come home with you. And so this also belongs into the camp of I can't find other explanations necessarily for what happened for Mitch. Mm-hmm. And so what happened is we were on a homicide together. And once again, it's an awful pattern, but it's statistically borne out. It was a case where an estranged husband and wife, the husband murdered the wife. This time he also murdered her mother too. So he killed two people. And Mitch was a young investigator at the time. And it was interesting working a crime scene, on TV. When they show a crime scene, it's always this scene of activity. There's lots of people going around and snapping pictures and, but actually based on the ebb and flow of people coming and going, there can be a time when you're alone with the deceased individual. Yeah. And it's, in the beginning, that's a little bit weird. For me, after 23 years of doing this, I guess I'm pretty desensitized and it doesn't feel that weird anymore. But when you're a new investigator, it's a little bit odd. It's experience you've never had in real life and normal life to be sitting there alone with someone who's been murdered. Mm-hmm. But so Mitch is there, and just purely as kind of a mental exercise, he knelt down in front of the young woman who was murdered and said, "Tell me what happened to you." Mm-hmm. And he wasn't expecting a reply. He wasn't actually trying to ask her. It was a mental exercise.
Yeah, it's one of those rhetorical questions that you would do. You're talking aloud and you're thinking it through. And
Exactly. Rhetorical question. Great way to put it. just so he could get himself into the frame of mind to begin to analyze the situation and figure it out. But when he said that, as soon as he said that, the power went off in the room.
Mm-hmm.
He was in the dark with these two murdered individuals. And he said, when you talk to him now, he says, I don't know how long I was in it. I don't know how long it was dark. It felt like an hour, but it was probably just, 30 seconds, a minute, who knows. But then the lights pop back on and he's a little bit shaken because that was really weird. Like right as he says that, this happens.
Yeah.
And so he walks out of the room where the two victims are. And we were standing on the street. I don't know. After all these years, I don't remember what we were doing out there, but we might have just been getting some fresh air, taking a break. And so he comes out there and he's like, hey guys, did the power go out here in the neighborhood? Did you guys notice any, did it get dark here out on the street? And we all look at each other and we're like, no, the street lights were on, the house lights were on. We didn't really notice anything. And so he's like, oh, okay. Weird things happen, so we just went about and, did the next 2 days worth of work that we had to do. And he kind of put the whole experience, just behind him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not long after that case, weird things started to happen at Mitch's house. And so, for example, the power, once again, this particular spirit, entity or whatever, she seemed to kind of favor messing with the electrical. And you hear that a lot. I mean, that's a common trope or a common occurrence with paranormal things, that there's power disturbances.
Yeah.
Or electronics or whatever. But he would have, he would wake up and the power in an entire room would be off and the circuit wouldn't be tripped or anything. Just there would be no power in a room. And
right.
One morning he came in late to work and we were razzing him and he's like, I don't know, my alarm clock just didn't go off and everything in that room was dead. And so he just started to notice these electrical anomalies, but it was kind of a new house. The house was only a few years old. So, that's easy to kind of put, just explain away. But then he started to notice that his dog was acting very strangely. And he had a pug.
Mm-hmm.
Whose name was the Dude. And we dedicated the book to him. There's a picture of him in front of the book. He was a funny dog. He was a great dog. But the Dude started to act very strangely. Now, pugs are kind of a weird inbred breed anyway, but the Dude started to act very strangely. And the thing that Mitch started to notice that really freaked him out is that the Dude would just be laying down in a room and all of a sudden his head would pop up and his eyes and his head would track something going across the room, just like it would if someone had walked across the room.
Yes.
And this started to happen all the time. And then he would just point to an empty corner of the house and start barking. And then when Mitch would go into the bathroom and shut the door, the dog would freak out. And just so all these things started to happen and accumulate. And once again, it's easy to kind of, any one of these isolated circumstances to kind of just ignore, but he started to feel a little bit of foreboding, like something really weird is going on here. Mm-hmm. Well, one day, Mitch was single at the time, and he, really handsome kid, dated a lot of beautiful women. We were always, we always teased him about it. But one day he brings home a new girlfriend to the house, and this is the first time she'd been to his house. And she walked in and she looks around and kind of stops and says, there's a ghost in this house. And Mitch is like, okay. So it turns out that she was an intuitive, whatever you want to call it. For her, the veil is thin, right? She could feel spirits, or however you want to put it. So she just, walked in and said, there's a ghost in this house. And at that point, Mitch was like, it all kind of, all these weird, seemingly disconnected experiences kind of rushed together, like he was starting to think that things were weird, but when that girl said there's a ghost here, everything kind of rushed together, or everything kind of came together for him. And so the girl could communicate with them. She was an intuitive. I don't know. I'm sure some people just think that's hogwash, poppycock. But for her, she felt she could feel them and she could communicate them. So she started to ask Mitch questions, and by a process of elimination, she figured out, this girlfriend, that the ghost in the house that the dude was seeing that was messing with his electricity was the ghost, the spirit of the girl who was murdered, that he had knelt down in front of and said, "Tell me what happened to you." When he did that, he somehow opened up himself to her to attach to him, and she followed him home. And so when we hear this story, we're like, Mitch, even the dead girls want to hang out with you. And so we teased him about that for a while, but it was just one of those things. And so that was, when he's telling us his whole story, we're like, well, it all kind of fits, and I don't know, like maybe once again, a person who's dead set on their mind that spirits don't exist and there's no such thing as the afterlife and all these things, I guess you can dismiss all these things. But where I try to take that bottom up approach, I can't tell him he didn't experience what he experienced, right? Mm-hmm. Like who am I to tell him that?
Now, the obvious questions following on that is, did the intuitive girlfriend stay with him? And did the dead woman stay with him? What happened next?
That's a good question. And no, the intuitive did not stay his girlfriend. But the spirit did linger in that house, and he eventually moved away. But things kind of calmed down. Like once that contact was made, things like the electrical problems and different things really did subside. Stuff happened every now and again, and the dog would still see things and act a little weird. But it was like once he knew that it was there, and once there was some contact made, they all just kind of lived together. It's like, oh well, like if you're going to be here, like I don't know, and he doesn't know. Like he moved away and moved into another house, and she didn't follow him to the second house. But yeah, her spirit never went away as long as he lived there. Yeah, Mitch dated a lot of girls at that time. He's happily married now for many years, and that's when he was a lot younger. But yeah, the intuitive, who knows where she is now.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Have there been any instances where these experiences, paranormal experiences, have actually contributed to the solution of the crime? I mean, as you said, a lot of them are ex or soon-to-be ex-husbands murdering their spouses. And again, statistically, as you well know, and certainly it's the case in the UK, that is the most frequent type of homicide that you get, a domestic that turns violent. But have there been any instances where the ghost has been able to provide a clue or something?
In my book and in the stories that I've accumulated, no. But I have heard on other radio programs and different paranormal things, there are examples where that has happened. And a lot of times it comes in the form of dreams. And there was, I wish I could remember the incidents right now, but I think it was an NYPD case where the detectives just kept having dreams about a certain aspect of the case that they hadn't really examined. And they were almost nightmares. They were really vivid. And when they went back and looked at it again, looked at that aspect, it totally solved the case. I apologize. I wish I could remember the details.
No, that's not a problem. Yeah.
But yeah, and that's what the times that I've heard that it's come in dreams. It hasn't really been like the movie Ghost or whatever, where there's really tangible things, but a lot of times. And I heard an interesting story too, kind of along those lines, where it was a detective who he called into a paranormal radio show, and he was saying when he was kind of young in his career, he had this really gruesome homicide, and sometimes this is really bad when people do this, but they will show other officers or whatever the crime scene photos, and these officers have nothing to do with the case. They kind of have no business seeing these photos, but they'll show them anyway, more like a, hey, look what I had to do,
Yeah.
And this officer was kind of showing around the pictures of this case to his cop buddies, and he had some horrible nightmares of the dead girl chastising him for showing her pictures to other people. And they were really vivid and really horrible. And so when he stopped showing them around, the nightmare stopped. I thought that was interesting. And like you could say, well, maybe that's just his guilty subconscious, but I don't know. Like, it seemed real to him. It seemed like he was getting some sort of visitation. And I mean, and at this point, it's probably a good time to say, I like we talked about in the beginning, you would think that policemen and people in the forensic sciences and different things that, like you said, were they're interested in, just the facts, ma'am, like Joe Friday would say, that they would be pretty averse to dealing in the paranormal. But when I went out and started asking officers to collect stories just for my own amusement, and then really in earnest when I was trying to put this book together, I was amazed at, so many officers have these experiences. And a lot of time, they at first are like, why are you asking me this? Are you trying to make fun of me? But then when they see that, you're earnest and maybe you share some of your own stories, then they open up. And I would say the majority of the cops that I asked had some sort of paranormal experience, whether they attributed it to that or not. And I think it is, we deal with death all the time, and we deal with people in their extremities all the time. And if you look at different theories or different paradigms in paranormal, death and extreme pain and suffering, those are things that cause a lot of these ghostly things to happen.
Yes, that's a very supposedly common cause of a haunting, that it's the scene of their death or some highly traumatic experience in life, and it leaves almost like a magnetic imprint on the environment. Yes.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting, the magnetic imprint's a really interesting idea too. And I'm not sure if you've gotten to this story in the book. I know I only sent it to you a couple days ago, but one of the weirdest things that is in the book that I don't necessarily have an explanation for, and to be fair, my book, it's basically designed to be campfire stories, right? I don't really go into the whys and the hows and the scientific, any explanations for it. It's some chilling stories that are just kind of fun to read. But I did notice some different paradigms that kind of popped up. But the weird story that I really have a hard time wrapping my mind around is, it seems like that I am haunting my office.
Tell me more.
And so the last time I checked, I'm not dead. Maybe I'm dead. Maybe this, Charles, maybe this is the best interview you've ever had, because this is from
yes. I think I've got just a normal Skype address here. I don't think Skype's that good.
Yeah, for sure. But I've had multiple fellow employees have what you would consider to be a ghostly experience with my voice. And the three stories that are in the book, there's others, but these are the three that I wrote down. One night, one of my coworkers named Angie, she was alone at the office, and she was back in the records room, which is kind of the furthest away from all of our offices and stuff, but it's well lit. It's not really creepy back there, but it's kind of far removed from where everybody's at. But she was alone in the office, and she was filing some files, and clear as day, she hears my voice right behind her say, Angie. And she wasn't frightened. She was like, oh. And this is late. This is like at 2 a.m. or something. She's like, oh, what's Paul doing here? And so she turns around, fully expecting to see me, and I'm not there. And so she's like, oh, okay, well, maybe he went back. And so she walked and she looked in every room in the office, looked out to see if my car was parked there. Nope, no me. I wasn't there at all. And so that freaked her out a little bit. And so she jumped in the car and just kind of drove around for the rest of her shift. And okay, that's a weird story. Like, our building's kind of noisy. It has this metal roof, and when it heats and cools at various points in the day, it kind of pops and there's noises. Like, who knows? Maybe she heard weird. But another one of my employees was in our lab area processing some evidence, and from the area, down the hall of our office, she hears me call her name. And this was in the middle of the day, so that's a little less strange. I wasn't working that day, but I could have stopped by to get something. And so she walks out to greet me, and once again, I'm not there.
You're not there.
Like, she looks, no, my car's not in the parking lot. She just looks all over. I'm not there. And then another female employee, coworker, she heard me sneeze one day, and I have this really distinctive sneeze. I inherited it from my father. She heard me sneeze, and she looks around in the office, and I'm nowhere to be seen. And so, and other stuff like this has happened as well. So these three coworkers of mine heard my voice, recognized it distinctively, and I'm nowhere to be found. So what is the explanation for that? And if it just happened to one of them, whatever, but it seemed to have happened. Now, could it be that it is a spirit mimicking my voice to trick them? You hear of the trickster variety of poltergeist. That's a paradigm in the paranormal. There's a trickster. So that's one explanation. But like you brought up earlier, there's also an explanation that some of these hauntings or things that we attribute to spirits or ghosts or whatever are actually just like a hiccup in time, or that we are imprinted, something imprints itself on a building. Yeah. What is it called? The tape recorder of stone?
The stone tape theory, yes.
Is that the explanation from it? I've worked in that building for many years. I've poured my professional energies into that place. It is just part of me recorded there. I don't know. But once again, something anomalous, something weird is happening. I can't dismiss it. I can't say, oh, you didn't hear my voice. That's just ridiculous. I can't tell them that. And so what exactly is going on? I don't know, but something strange is happening. And I just can't, even though like I said, I'm pretty skeptical of a lot of stuff, I can't rule this out. I can't tell them they didn't experience what they experienced.
That is intriguing, that. Do you think one of the issues is that the very nature of your and other police officers' work is that they are often the first on the scene of a gory crime, a body found in a lonely place in the middle of the night, which even for, hardened police investigators who've encountered that must have an effect on you and mess with your mind. Is it a case of you're getting oversensitized and you're feeling things or think you're feeling things and sensations that are perfectly understandable in the circumstances? as opposed to it's actually a paranormal phenomenon, an independent paranormal phenomenon. It's just the circumstances of their work that's doing it.
You can't rule that out for sure. And I mean, they just kind of in the past few years, people have taken more of an interest in the mental health of law enforcement and, examining post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. And the forensic side of it, they're a little bit slower looking at us. There aren't as many of us as police. I mean, we have a different kind of a stress.
Yeah.
We have more of a chronic stress where officers have more acute. They respond to a scene and someone's mad at them and trying to fight them. And that happens and is over pretty quick. They find a dead body, but then they get to leave. Where we have more of a chronic stress where, okay, the dead body's been found. Now I have to sit here with this dead body for the next day trying to figure out what happened to it. And so, I mean, like you said, we are dealing with these raw emotions. We are dealing with stuff that most normal, good people don't have to deal with. And yeah, you can exclude it. And I like I said, when I was talking about the story where the people were living in the apartment where the murder happened, when we were going into that apartment and you felt like she was there, I think, who knows if we were actually feeling her spirit or if it was just the enormity of the situation. So, yeah, I wouldn't rule that out at all. I mean, unfortunately, the longer you do it, I guess, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, the longer you do it, you do become more desensitized to it. When I see a murder scene now after 23 years of doing this, it's a lot different than when I was in my first year.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wouldn't rule out that that's kind of part of it at all. But then, when you get into other circumstances where, like in that story where those people are describing doors and lights that they really have no business kind of knowing what happened, that's an independent, that's kind of an objective corroboration to, something was going on. But, it's one of those things. And, like I keep saying, I'm pretty skeptical of a lot of stories. I mean, another paradigm that I've kind of noticed as I've talked to different people is that there seems to be a lot of weird things that happen with the associated to evidence. So when you have a person's belongings who's been murdered and it's soaked in their blood or whatever, and you dry it in your lab and then you put it in your evidence room, that a lot of weird stuff is associated with that. And so at various times, my coworkers will be, oh, our office is haunted and oh, so many weird things happen. And a lot of times I'm just like, well, that was just the roof, or, that it's just a reflection, or, I'm kind of the first one to be like, oh no, but then, other stuff happens where it's harder to dismiss it. Like we had two different members of our staff who saw something out of the corner of their eye, like a man walking down the hall of our office out of the corner of our eye. And they both, without having talked to each other, described his clothing the same. That he had khaki pants on and a certain color polo shirt. And like, that's one of those things that's like, oh, you both nailed his physical description and what his clothing looked like. Maybe there is something here, but I don't know. It's interesting. Like I said, my book, it's designed to be fun. And you've probably noticed where you've started. It's kind of, each chapter is part kind of CSI or forensic insider knowledge or kind of my musings on my job. And then it transitions into the weird story. Yeah. And so, that serves a dual purpose. I guess it was some of those chapters were like a stream of consciousness almost for me, just like these are things that happen and it kind of relates. But, Yeah, I don't take any sort of scientific approach to this, the question of are there ghosts. These are designed just to be fun campfire type stories. Like I love folklore.
Yeah.
And I loved hearing stories from my scoutmasters around the campfire when I was a kid. I love, hearing people tell their ghost stories. I mean, to me, it's more of folklore than this is a scientific treatise on what these hauntings are. But
that's very interesting. That I'm conscious of the time, so can you give us one final chilling story from the book?
One final chilling story.
Yeah.
Let me try to think of some of my favorite.
Yeah, one of your favorites.
I think one of my favorites is when, from where I'm sitting about about 500 feet away from the Ogden City Cemetery right now.
Right, yes.
And the Ogden City Cemetery is one of the oldest cemeteries in Utah. And, when we talk about old cemeteries in the United States, especially in the West, you people in the UK probably laugh.
Yeah.
Because you have Roman ruins in your
yeah.
But this dates from the mid 1800s, and it's an old cemetery for our neck of the woods. Yeah. And there's like most cemeteries, there's kind of its resident ghost, and her name is Flo. And there's a lot of different stories surrounding how Flo died. I mean, one of the explanations is that she died in the Spanish flu pandemic in 1910, 1911. I guess that has resonance for us now as we're in our own pandemic.
Yep.
So that's one of the stories. There's other stories around her death, but it's the grave and the ghost that all the teenage kids kind of come and want to, take their girlfriends into the cemetery to scare them.
Yeah.
And so it's known throughout the whole region, and lots of people go there. But different officers have had different encounters with Flo. And like I said, the way I've designed my book is the first part will talk about law enforcement, different things that deal with our profession. And one of those for this chapter is that a lot of officers will go and park in the back of a cemetery to write their reports, to get caught up on their paperwork. And you might think, well, that's kind of a creepy way to go, or a place to go, but it serves two purposes. One, it's some stewardship over the cemetery at night. If there's a cop car there, then hopefully people aren't going to mess around with it. But also, officers want to go someplace quiet, because they can't just park in any old parking lot to do their report, because people are like, oh, there's a police car. I want to go tell them about a crime that happened to me 7 months ago.
Yeah.
Kind of a thing. And so, they'll frequently go to secluded places. And so a lot of them will go park in the Ogden City Cemetery, and many of them have had encounters with Flo. One of them saw these candles light on fire. And I can't remember if that's even in the book, because I think I heard that after the fact. But people would put candles and different things by her grave, and he saw them just spontaneously at night. And another officer saw a full torso apparition float by. And it's just funny because, like I said, Flo is very close to where I'm sitting right now. But one officer, he was parked in the back of the cemetery, and he saw this blue mist kind of come up over the ridge. And that's one of the ways that many people talk about Flo manifesting herself, as a blue mist. And so he looks up and sees a blue mist and goes back to his paperwork. And then he looks up a few minutes later, and he sees that blue mist is up over the ridge and kind of coming a little closer to him. And so he goes back down and starts doing his reports again. And then he looks up, and the blue mist is getting even closer and closer to his car. And so finally he's like, I'm going to get out of here. And so he hops his car into drive and takes off. And so later when he's telling me the story, I'm like, wow, that's incredible. And I said, what, were you scared? And he looks at me and he's like, no, I wasn't scared. And I'm like, you weren't? Why not? And he's like, well, I don't believe in ghosts.
But I'm just getting out of the way in case, yes.
Yeah, I'm like, well, you saw one.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you, Paul, ever so much for your time. And your book is Fingerprints and Phantoms, True Tales of Law Enforcement Encounters with Ghosts and the Paranormal. Good luck with that. Are you planning a follow-up? More tales? It sounds like there's a whole host of officers out there with tales.
Oh yeah, I'm eventually going to get around to it. I just recently finished I went back to school, so I've been pretty busy for the last couple years, but yeah, I'm going to get in the vein of starting to collect stories again, and hopefully there'll be a sequel. But yeah, life happens, you know how it is.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. Stuff gets in the way, yes.
Yeah.
Are you off duty this weekend, or is it a case of if something comes up, you'll be called in?
Well, I work tonight, starting at 10 o'clock, and then I go back again on Sunday. So Sunday's the start of my shift. So,
right.
Yeah, and if something really bad happens, I could get called in. But yeah, I kind of work all over the place.
Right. Well, on that note, thank you very much, Paul, once again. And, good luck. And tell us if you do encounter a ghost that gives you the clues. The name of the man who did it was.
That would be awesome.
Right. Thanks very much, Paul.
All right. Have a good day.
And you. Paul Rimmasch's book is published by Schiffer Publishing. You can also find it on Amazon. The UK price is £9.66. And you should also check out the Facebook page Fingerprints and Phantoms. Incidentally, you'll recall I asked Paul if he had any tales of ghosts coming back from the dead to say the name of the man who did it was. Well, no, he didn't. But there is a story in chapter 6 of Paul's book of a ghost of a John Doe, an unknown dead person, appearing in a hospital room to reveal his name. As I said in the interview, the writing style in Paul's book is very accessible and makes for an interesting read. Now, here's Janie with her green eyes. Now, Janie, I've been looking up some stuff here on the colour of people's eyes and the legends associated with it. And you, of course, have
Green eyes.
Exactly.
I've only had to remind you of that over the last few centuries a couple of times, but you finally got it.
Yes,
I've
indeed.
got green eyes.
And green is apparently the rarest of eye colours naturally occurring in only 2% of the world's population.
Yes, I knew that. I thought, well, if I can't be in the top 2% of intelligence, I will be in the top 2% of eye colour.
And it's apparently the only eye colour that changes, can becoming more green or sometimes a bit greyish or even blue-based, depending on mood, weather and surroundings. Have you ever noticed when you're in a rage, say, that your eyes turn a different hue of green? Or
Wow, it sounds like one of those really overblown, cheap novels, doesn't it? Well, her eyes blazed or her eyes grew dark. I think, no, they don't. Not the actual eye. I mean, it was the expression around it. So, yeah, now I'm going off topic a bit there. All I have noticed is that, obviously, if I wear a green T-shirt, which I'm wearing at the moment, my eyes look greener. Yeah, that's all I can say. What's kind of surrounding you does affect the colour of your eyes.
Right. And you will also like this bit. People with green eyes are often leaders.
Tick.
They tend to be good listeners and excellent speakers.
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening. What did you say?
Attracting other people like magnets.
No.
You are naturally curious.
Oh, yeah, I am very, as you know, I'm
Very intuitive.
Oh, Yes, I'm practically an empath.
Yeah. You're always easy to talk to?
I would say so, yes. I like to gossip. I like to chat. I think people realise that. In fact, they sort of edge away after a while. Oh, my God, she'll never stop.
And apparently they are tough, quick-witted and caring, and also make wonderful friends.
Ah, yes, I am. Because, you see, I'm Capricorn. And we're very loyal to our friends. If we make some friends, they're true friends, and I'll never give up on them, and I will always support them. And yeah, I would say that's very true. And obviously, there's no bad parts to my green-eyed personality.
Absolutely none. Absolutely none.
No. I'll buy that then.
Good. Okay. Off you go in your green jumper.
Okay. Bye.
And that's it, almost time to go. However, for those of you interested in folklore, you just might like to note that the 21st of September is, among many other things, St. Matthew's Day, and the weather on that day is an important marker associated with the grape harvest. Here's a little rhyme to go with it. Matthew Day, bright and clear, brings good wine in the new year. I possibly put cheer in there. Brings good wine, plenty of cheer. Anyway, on a grimmer note, the 21st is also the day to remember the martyrdom of Raud the Strong. Raud was a Viking warrior and a priest of the Old Norse pagan religion. He was tortured to death on the orders of the Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason, sometime towards the end of the 10th century, for refusing to renounce his old gods and convert to Christianity. According to legend, a poisonous snake was forced down Raud's throat, and the snake subsequently gnawed its way to freedom out of Raud's side. Nice. Don't cross the Christians then. Now it just remains for me to say this is Charles Christian saying thank you so much for listening in. Please join me again next week when we'll have more weird tales. Until then, stay well, stay weird, stay different.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.